Welcome to episode 40 of The Lowdown Show. I'm Neil Graham. This week, we talk about the mindset necessary to improve as an off-road rider. And I'm speaking with BJ Hessler, a woman who's done it all. From a degree in Latin American studies at Boston U, to a career in public health, to chucking it all away to form DC Dirt Camp, an East Coast school for off-road riders of all skill levels. BJ, I see that you started off on sport bikes, but more recently you've become one of us. You've become a dirt rider. Take me through that process of how you got off the pavement into the dirt.
Yeah, very much so. I started out at age 16, sneaking away from my family and figuring out how to ride. And it was a street option at that point. I lived in upstate New York, but didn't, it wasn't a thing. Nobody I knew rode off-road or anything, never knew about it. So from age 16 until about age 30 something, I just rode street bikes and thought at 5'6" that I was too short to ride adventure bikes. I thought I was, it was just going to be beyond my capability to ever do the ADV thing. And at the time, I thought my little SV 650 was a big bike. I had no idea what I didn't know. But then got a couple different opportunities came up. One, I did a trip with my dad to Patagonia and got on I think it was a GS 750, and had this grand plan that I'd go out before the rest of the tour. And while the guys were all having drinks and getting to know each other, I would go figure out how to mount and dismount this, what I thought was gigantic motorcycle, except everybody followed me out and they immediately were like, cool, let's just go for an evening ride, group. And I was like, ah! So I just kind of figured it out, kept it up with throttle and felt awkward and tippy-toed my way around the whole tour. But on that tour, I realized how much I wanted to travel by moto and that most of the world was not paved. So I better figure it out because I was so uncomfortable at speed on gravel or any of the, dirt stuff that we did, which was minimal on the tour, but it's still, for a never ever off-road rider, it was pretty harrowing. And watching some of the guides just dance on their bikes in it and be so comfortable, I really thought, oh my God, that is awesome. This is my new thing. I got to figure this out. And sure enough, as I now have seen a lot of people do, they tried to get the smallest adventure bike they could figure out how to manage and how to afford. And at the time I was like, I don't know, there's this Versus 650 for sale for cheap. I'm going to try that. It looks adventure-y. And I didn't know what I didn't know. And that became my first off-road bike because I paid the loan off and put handguards on it and a skid plate and started bashing it around in the woods and was like, yeah, I'm kind of getting it. And simultaneously, my brother, we lived together out in Colorado for a long time, and he had gotten into trail riding, and he's like, dude, you got to come check this stuff out. And I had already moved to the East Coast. So I went out and tried I think it was like an EXC 400 or something, humongous dirt bike. And he was like, don't worry about it. Just go, just travel up this trail. And I remember looking through the goggles being like, this is a billy goat trail that I shouldn't even be hiking. Like, why am I on a motorcycle? The idea of motorcycles was nice, smooth roads and beautiful scenery, and hiking and snowboarding and backcountry stuff was a whole different slow speed sport. To combine the two just messed with my head. And every time I came to a stop to stop panicking, I found a tree to post up on, put my foot up on, because I just thought there's no way you're going to keep this thing upright. But I was amazed at what the bike could handle. And I just thought, okay, there is something going on here. I got to figure out some training. So that's sort of where I dove into it.
So let me jump in. How did you get over the, and I think a lot of our listeners and viewers will understand that, especially women or riders of smaller stature, is the colossal height of ADV bikes. It's a real thing, isn't it? I'm 6 feet with a long inseam, so I personally don't know it, but I've seen it so many times, especially off road with the ADV bikes. I mean, first of all, how did you get your comfort level up? Now you're running. We're going to talk about your DC Dirt Camp in a minute, but how did you get your confidence up riding off road? Was it just throwing yourself at the wall until it stuck, or did you go for instruction? How did you get
A
there?
little bit of both. One, because I was on the Versus and tried going to dual sport events and just chasing people on bikes that were way more appropriate for the events, I realized that I was a really strong human. It's not a strong rider. My skills weren't there, but I was just an athlete. And so muscling a big bike around wasn't that hard for me once I figured out that I can only put one foot down at a time. Once I got one foot down on the ground, and I'm not sure who the first person who told me that was, but once I got there, I realized a lot of it could be done with lower body strength once I was up on the pegs. And I, of course, never even considered dabbing. That's still not a thing in my repertoire. And then I got to,
You say dabbing, you mean touching a foot down while you're riding.
right.
Because
Yep.
dabbing can lead to bad things, can it?
Absolutely. And it has for me, for sure. But then I got some off-road training on a small displacement dirt bike. I got onto a CRF 150, and even that at the time looked tall, felt tall. And yet once I got on it with one foot and threw my weight over it, the suspension sank. And I was like, oh, okay, this isn't that sketchy. And just getting to build up to the confidence to get back into the big bikes is where everything clicked in place for me. The stakes were lower, the risk was lower, the seat height wasn't necessarily lower, but because of the lower weight of the bike, it felt like lower stakes of tipping over. It wasn't that big a deal. If I tipped it over, I wasn't going to be stuck on the trail. I'd be able to lift it up again. And I really started, I was into weightlifting and running and all kinds of other sports, but finally realized like, oh, I've always been trying to lose weight. I've always been trying to get smaller. I've always been trying to be cute on a bike. And any women in motorcycle gear can tell you, you do not feel cute in motorcycle gear. Like if you're protected, you look pretty dumb. It's unless you're like miniature and maybe some of the street gear or whatever, but adventure gear generally, I don't think any of us feel like we look our hottest in that. And it was a real mental shift for me to finally realize, oh, my big thighs and my like strong ass are a humongous asset in this sport. Like to finally feel like there's a reason I'm this strong. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. I don't need to get light as a feather to run forever. I need to learn how to pick up a fat bike with my big butt. I can throw things around because I was in pretty good shape when I started. I tell my students now that was also a downfall because I was trying to muscle the bike. And I've now learned that the bike will always win. And I need to learn finesse, a lot more finesse. And getting back to my old, teenage ballet roots was a little bit better, more helpful than any kind of CrossFit training was.
You said something kind of interesting, and I've certainly heard this from women riders before, this idea of this notion of that you have to appear a certain way. And is that where does that come from, do you think? Is it just the fact that motorcycling is this male-dominated universe, and as a woman, did anyone ever say anything to you, or was it just assumed that you had to look a certain way?
No. I think it is absolutely internal. I think that is internal cultural upbringing, just societal norms and values that women have historically all been valued for our appearance. I was raised by a hardcore feminist who actually called me BJ from the beginning so that nobody would know in 1978 if her baby's resume was male or female. She was very progressive in that way. So I wasn't personally raised to worry about my appearance, but that still infiltrated all areas of my life because I'm a woman in America. But I absolutely do not think that the industry says you got to be tiny and cute to make it overtly. I think we all still see advertising, and you don't see a whole lot of out of shape people doing adventure in general because it is such an active sport, but we don't see a whole lot of varied body types up until recent years. But no, I think that was an absolutely internal standard that I put on myself, thinking like, the value comes from being good at all the stuff the boys are good at, but also making sure you look good doing it. Whereas I don't think men really think about what they're wearing when they're riding, like, oh, does my butt look big when I go over this camel hump? No one has ever thought that with a man brain. I doubt. But I got to go to the BMW Academy way back with a friend, and I had no gear. I wore frog togs over my saggy street pants, like a man's Joe Rocket set of pants. And, I had done some of my own tailoring on a ghetto jacket, and the butt of my frog togs split. And the guy that was filming from the Speed Channel came over to tell me. And I was like, oh my God, only the girl, right? With the braids sticking out of my helmet. And I was so wrapped up about what I was going to look like for this Speed Channel spot that I was completely distracted by my riding. And I realized, like, all right, I got to get over it. And being in a helmet and just being one of the guys and doing this sport has been a huge component of me getting over that. It's so much less in our industry. I think it's a way, way less important factor of what you look like than in a whole lot of other industries I could have landed in. I mean, honestly, I think in any other industries where you're not wearing a full face helmet, right? What you look like does influence people, their first impressions, their last impressions. I know we'd all like to think we're above that, but I think people really do make assumptions or, create stories about a person based on what they see first. I think a lot of us overcome it. I can only speak for myself, but
it's kind of our default, isn't it?
It is.
It can be, yeah.
Yeah, it is. And, I've worked that to my advantage quite a bit. Since I started the company, I've had pink hair, and it's just kind of fun because I don't have to fit the mold. I used to go to an office and I have a little septum ring, and I used to take this out every Monday and cover up all my tattoos and fit the part of a corporate executive. And now it's really funny to watch people's reactions at how surprised they are by me, that people are kind of like, you can tell they're not expecting somebody to be articulate or whatever the stereotype of
right.
a punk rock kid with tattoos is. Or it's just been real fun. That stereotype also has been broken a lot, where I get students showing up and they're like, oh, you're BJ. They don't realize they're going to come train with a woman. And that part's kind of fun too, to see.
So back to your mother's thing, right? Mm-hmm. DJ, so they don't know who you are. So you mentioned your dirt camp. How did that start, and what was the catalyst for that? Because you were a street rider, and then all of a sudden you hit the dirt, but it's a big step from being just an off-road rider or a dirt rider to running your own school. I can imagine that was a pretty huge step.
It was. It absolutely was. Like I said, I was doing the corporate job. I was in healthcare finance, and got to go on a couple of these different adventures and really got hooked on figuring out how to ride dirt. And it sounds real woo-woo, but I swear, as soon as I started even turning my mind toward the idea of it, all these doors started flying open for me. Started first opening my mind to the idea that, like, maybe this isn't it. Chasing the corporate dollar and accumulating stuff was highly unsatisfactory to me. And I had hit, I guess we would call it, kind of an emotional bottom. I was a pretty heavy drinker and did a fair amount of drugs over my life, and eventually just couldn't stand myself anymore. I cleaned up my act, found recovery. And about 3 years into recovery, I was still working the corporate job, had just discovered off-roading, but I just couldn't keep moving forward. There was a bottom there that I hit, even sober, that I really didn't feel there was much value to my life anymore. I had a few bikes, a few dudes, great job. Supposedly the world was my oyster, and I was completely unfulfilled. So I started daydreaming about, like, what else could I do with myself? And it ended up with a psych stay where I truly didn't care if I woke up the next morning. And I had an epiphany in the hospital that said, well, wait a minute. If you don't care if you live or die, then why are you protecting your 401k and your future earnings so much? Just wing it. See what else you could do. And at that point, that's when all these like mystical doors started opening. I got plucked out of nowhere. Somebody reached out and said, "Hey, I have an off-road dirt bike training school just out north of Baltimore. Do you want to come apprentice with me?" They needed a token female on their Instagram or something. So I went up and started helping training for free, spending my money to go figure out where to stay, but at the same time was getting access to dirt bikes and meeting more people in the community. Learned about the Motorcycle Safety Foundation dirt bike school curriculum and found out that that's a pretty good pipeline to get into this industry. So kept asking the owner of that company to get me certified. I wanted to be a real coach. This is pretty cool. Brought friends up to his school and they gave me really good feedback that I was a very effective communicator in terms of coaching and skills development and things like that. And I thought, oh, really? I'm a teacher? That's kind of cool. That's fulfilling. Meanwhile, I was still working the day job. But eventually I just decided, I see a few holes in your business model and I appreciate the hand up, but I'm going to go do my own thing. I was part of a trail riding club that had a little parcel of land south of Washington, D.C. And I approached the landowners and said, "Hey, those like 5 acres of undeveloped houses over there, can I cultivate that land and work a separate lease with you? I'd like to rent 5 acres. And brought in mowing equipment and flew out to California, got my MSF dirt bike school curriculum certification. And they had told me, "Oh yeah, once you're certified, you just go to a dealership and you can work out a dealer loan program for a whole fleet of bikes from a dealership." And I found out that was true in like the 90s. Totally not viable.
It's good because it sounds kind of naive, but yeah.
And I was so naive, and I am so grateful for that naivete still, because if I knew the challenges I was going to get into as an entrepreneur, I wouldn't have had the balls to do this. But because I didn't know what I didn't know, I've been like, whatever, we're in this deep. Now I got to figure it out. Right. So I started DC Dirt Camp in 2018. I had,
just in time for the pandemic. Nicely done.
Yep. Yeah. I had about 80 students, probably half of them I had to bribe to come down to let me train them to figure out how to teach and sort of practice on people. But I had started buying up a few little Hondas and left them in a shipping container down at this rental place and drove back and forth and slept in a shed several nights down there, slept in my car a lot, trying to make this thing work for a couple days in a row. And then 2019, I decided I was going to leave corporate America. Had a partner at the time, a boyfriend who was living in my house too. So I thought, all right, the mortgage is I finally got a little bit of help on it, and he's really into dirt bikes and this is going to be awesome. He said, "Go for it. We're going to make a go of this in 2020. So I left in the summer of 2019 and squirreled away as many nuts as I could to reopen in March of 2020. And we all know how that went down. So I was pretty freaked out right out of the gate. I was up to some really tremendous challenges, but again, it was just good luck and circumstance. And I ended up with almost 500 students the first year of COVID. So all of a sudden,
you were able to run during COVID?
So I usually opened, the plan was to open from March through until it got too hot in the summer. And so we had to stay closed until I think it was about late May. We finally opened and did May and June. And then the fall started doing the masking. And once everybody got kind of used to what the protocols were and how to stay far apart, and because it was an outdoor event, people really were dying to come out and do something with their kids, with their spouses, without their family, both. And so it exploded. It really exploded. And all of a sudden I thought, oh, this is a whole new challenge. Now I have to learn how to run a business, not just teach a couple little classes here and there. So I was very, very fortunate that I was able to ride that wave with COVID and the boom of women in adventure segment. I think that's been, we've all heard that that's the growing market. They're buying more, spending more proportionally and things like that. And there's a lot of little niches that I can fit into in that category too. But yeah, my learning has continued to grow. I've been doing trainings on my own every year to get my riding better, but also to learn how other coaches do it. I also really early on started working with a woman named Pat Jakes of ADV Woman out in Colorado. She had been running a really successful training school where she does single events, big, huge training sessions, multi-day events. And I had gotten wind of it and I thought, I'm going to go check that out. And I drove across the country, introduced myself after riding for like a year and was like, hi, I'm going to work for you by next summer. She was like, who are you? Cool. Good luck with that. But I won her over and she was definitely a mentor of mine, taking me on some, I did some scouting trips and some hosting with her on BDR routes and things out west, and actually got to be part of her spot on Makeup to Mud. Toyota was doing a big thing with that. And her whole story is really helping to empower the next generation of women to be following in her footsteps. So I absolutely owe her a ton.
So I'm always interested and curious about how we learn things, because a lot of us learn very differently. I have a daughter who's a very challenging young woman, and she has to have things a certain way or else she becomes discouraged. And if she has some modicum of success initially, then she's invested. And I don't know, maybe we're all the same way. I don't know. But what is your experience, and specifically teaching women and men? What do you find the differences? And before you answer, I mean, and one of the things that I find sort of curious about this question is, I was speaking to someone who runs off-road tours in Europe, and he said one of the major problems they have is men who overestimate their riding capability. So if they're coming over and they're going to do this off-road thing through the Alps or whatever, or Namibia or wherever it is, when they interview these people prior to them coming, they have to have this kind of code. So if somebody said, yeah, I used to ride a dirt bike, that means it was a YZ80 when they were 9, and they haven't done anything since. So what do you find the difference between men and women?
Absolutely. I certainly relate to your daughter. I tried guitar as a kid for like 5 minutes, but I wasn't instantly good at it. So I decided guitar was dumb. It wasn't me. Guitar was just dumb. But
Right.
With dirt bikes, I've gotten hooked on that kind of success because the learning curve is so steep, but it also is so long. Like the continuation of learning has gotten me hooked personally. And then sort of my philosophy with the school is learn from my mistakes and let me help hold your hand so that you don't lose out on seat time. Because that's been the biggest bummer for me is and I'll say this pejoratively, even though I know most of your audience is probably male, I rode like a dude when I first started, where it was all balls, no brains. I just was like, I'll figure it out. Just give me a bike. I'm going to go do it. And that is still one of the biggest differences I see with male students versus female students is, yes, men overestimate their capabilities and women underestimate their capabilities. Men want to get the gist of what you're talking about and then try it and bring it into their bodies right away. Women, I find, want to hear about the drill, want to see the drill, want to understand the logic behind a drill, want to understand the technique completely in their mind. And I oftentimes have to nudge people out of the barn and be like, all right, now we really do have to get on the bikes and try this.
Right.
You're going to learn this viscerally. So part of what I brought into the school was a lot of injuries. Having ridden like an athlete, but not a dancer, with no training and a lot of ambition, it didn't work for me. I've had my knee rebuilt twice, and I've had my thumbs worked on. Like, I've had a lot of injuries from dumb stuff that was probably avoidable. And all the people that I taught way back in 2018, 19, 20, they're off racing enduros and hare scrambles and killing it out there now. And there's no way I'm nearly as good as they are as a rider, because I've lost at least half a season every other year due to injury. So instead of being like, live fast, die young, I used to be all punk rock. Now I'm like, live to ride another day. I think I'm getting sleepy. So let's pack it in.
Right.
And that's one of the things that I try to give people the out in my class a lot. I try to say, like, this is the no bravado zone. Like, we do not have any egos at dirt camp. When I see egos walking down my driveway, like, you put a target on your own back, because I will definitely take people down a peg if they walk in like, what are you going to teach me? I've been doing this forever. I'm like, well, either then you don't really need to be here, or my job is now going to become a challenge to figure out what it is you still could learn. And I'm very proud to say that I have never had any riders come here, because I get a fair amount of riders that do have experience, even though I'm relatively like a newbie school. A lot of people come and just want to take the class to support their partner or their kid or something like that. And I'm yet to have a single one of them tell me, yeah, that was a waste of my time. Every single one of them, even if they've, gone to all of the schools and they've been riding all over the world, they still say, like, oh, yeah, I never thought about the technique that way, or the way you described it was great, or seeing myself on video was really helpful, or I'm glad you had the comms in my helmet so I could hear what you were doing. And that part's been really satisfying to me, that I'm able to speak to all the different levels of students. But to your point, I'm very aware that people have super different learning styles. So I address that right at the beginning of every class. I let people know, we're going to talk about a skill. I may even draw it on the board. We will show you a demonstration of it live. We will talk about the philosophy. We'll answer your questions. And then we're going to ask you to attempt to do it, and we'll give you one-on-one feedback. I also have been taking out my phone a lot and doing video, just 5-second videos of people. And then at a break, I show them on the phone, here's what you looked like standing up. Is that what you thought you looked like? And generally, those two concepts are pretty far apart.
Well, it's actually, if I can jump in, that's interesting that you say that. And I think one of the best things that ever happened to me as a progression as a rider was working at a magazine. So when I would go to a sport bike launch at a racetrack, I was always photographed.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and as you know, and as a lot of people listening to this know, that, when you're a new rider, you think you've got that much lean angle, when really you're a few degrees off center.
Yep.
And seeing that, and you think you're in a certain body position, but you look like you're frozen at the bars. And I think seeing that was like,
Yep.
oh boy. And then you really get with the program. So I think video, because and I'm like, for instance, I live near a ski hill, and I've never seen myself skiing, and apparently I don't bend my knees, even though I think I'm bending my knees. So I think the whole thing with video, but just another point too, which I think is an interesting thing. I've ridden on racetracks and through the woods with some of with Cyril Dupree, 5-time Dakar winner, and other really incredible riders. And I think a lot of us, a lot of the general riding public think that a good rider may be here and there may be there, when really it's
yeah,
we're legions apart, aren't we?
right.
And the room for growth is infinite.
Absolutely.
Because we will never reach them. And I mean, is that something that because if you have an ego, man, you ride with those good riders, it is squashed within the first 50 yards.
Absolutely. And I think that sort of the delta there, it's like a rude awakening when it happens, because usually it's that first 2 seconds on a trail that you go out with the group that says, yeah, we're new, don't worry, we're slow. And what they call slow is your best day 5 years from now.
Right.
There's so much variability that a lot of times people are like, oh God, I had no idea what I didn't know, once they're already in trouble and they find themselves alone. Or in my case, I was pushing myself too hard to keep up with those people, try to keep up. And all of a sudden I'm going beyond my skill level. And those were some hard lessons learned. So I try to get people prepared for that by saying, like, look, you just spent all day learning the first skill. Like, once you master that, you can actually start riding. And that's where I offer a 2-day class, and a lot of people come back to me for a second day after they learn to use the clutch. I'm talking like very, very beginners. Um, because they think by the end of the day, they're like, yeah, I'm riding. And I was like, actually, you're just rolling a motorcycle under power with a little bit of clutch. Like, you haven't even gotten to what riding is, to try to give them an idea. But I think having any kind of firsthand experience on a motorcycle gives people such an appreciation for once they get out and everybody's watching YouTube and Poltars, and they realize the size of the bike that he's doing stuff on and the agility and just everything that it takes. All of a sudden, I think it's like an aha that people can't experience unless they've actually sat on a motorcycle and struggled through those kind of learning curves on their own. So that's where you were saying, the differences between men and women, and that's one of my goals with the school is to adopt more ways of coaching. Between having a very diverse staff of coaches, I have a pretty deep bench of very part-time folks that help me out, and I take months of having them shadow me and work through our curriculum and make sure that they're the type of people that I want to represent my brand. But we have a lot of diversity, and I think that speaks to the clientele that also come here from the DC metro region and beyond. We get a lot of different walks of life and a lot of different learning styles. So if I don't get through to somebody, it's oftentimes me and the other coach will tag each other out. If I'm really struggling with a kid and I start getting frustrated because he's just not computing what I'm saying, we'll just switch. And it usually doesn't fail that somebody else can get through to someone if I can't, then, and the showing, telling, doing feedback loop is a big part that I think encompasses most student learnings. But adding video is a big goal of mine for 2025. We just put a big TV out in the barn and trying to plug in a digital device right then and have instant feedback up on a bigger screen. I just started using Cardos this year. So I have 15 Cardos that I can pair the whole team with. I hand people little earbuds that they put up in their borrowed helmets because I've got so many sizes of helmets. I didn't wire them all up, but they've been working out really, really well so that, I'll call out a name to give a specific correction. And the feedback has been from the other students, oh, wow, yeah, you said, Bobby, stand up taller. And I realized I was squatting over the bike. It told me to stand up too. I was listening to all those instructions. So that's been a really helpful way to get more direct feedback into really small classes also. I've been to some trainings where there's, 25, 30 people and one or two coaches. And it just felt like, hey, are you going to watch me? Hey, did you see me on that lap? Hey, was I doing it right?
Right.
And you get like 5 minutes of coaching time directly. And that's just hard to do. I get why folks do that. I mean, running the business now, I have every incentive to run humongous classes too, but I really enjoy the one-on-one aha moments that I get to see.
How do you deal with people who become discouraged? Because I've done a bunch of schools, road racing and off-road things over the years. And I did one, a BMW school in Germany, off-road school. And there was a woman there, a young woman, and she just got so down on herself. I mean, she sort of had a breakdown. And then and then of course she was embarrassed, and everybody else was there. And how do you pull people back from that? And it's easy for riders of some experience to be kind of blasé about those things. But when you're in the middle of it, I mean, I have this nightmare. I'm a kind of a 3-chord guitarist, and I have this recurring nightmare where I'm on stage and I'm like, I've got a cello and I'm with an orchestra. And I realize that I don't know how to play the cello. And there's that kind of panic that sets in, and you wake up, in the cold sweats and all that. But it's terrifying when you're in this group activity and you feel that you just can't get it. So what do you do?
That is a really good question. It's a very case by case thing. And I've had a lot of folks tell me after the fact, like, thanks so much for being there with me on it. And I'm like, oh, I didn't think I was doing anything special, but I think Because I'm a woman, I think there's a good barrier that dissolves where I actually touch people, and I think it would get weird for a lot of students if it was a dude, but I'll actually walk up to a student who's freaking out, and I put my hand over their clutch with their hand on the inside. Um, and it's not necessarily to give them a technique of how to slowly release the clutch. It's to give them my calmness. It's to give them that like human touch that gets them to stop thinking and feeling in their nervous system, but get them into their body physically. I'm a very anxious person in general, and I've learned a million different techniques, some of which I remember how to employ. But for me, it's always about getting into my body. Where are my feet? Where are my knees? I'm touching the bike. I'm moving. I can feel the wind. Like, if I can focus on the visceral, the actual tactile sensations, for me, I know I can calm my mind down. And when I can take my mind off of the feedback loop of you suck, you can't get this, this is such, you suck, blah, blah, blah. The mean girl stuff is self-reinforcing that I find a lot of times I can see it coming, and I'll get very close to people. I'll pull them out, and, I pull the headsets off so I'm not talking to the whole group, and just say like, hey, I can't tell you the number of times I have cried on my dirt bike. If you have to have a good cry right now, there's no shame in that, and just relate to people from personal experience. Because I've definitely been on trails that I'm like, you're not doing a quick out and back. You're on a loop trail, and it's like, I can't keep going. My forearms are so tired. Oh my God. And I get into the, how did you think you were going to do this? You're so dumb. You're holding everybody back. That I have to like get into my body. So I try to coach from that perspective. The other thing that I really attempt to do is set up a team dynamic at the beginning of the class. I try to set an expectation that we're working together, and that off-roading is a team sport, even though you're on your own bike, because that's been my experience. People really do feel better when other people cheer for them. And so whenever somebody drops a bike, I'm always like, hey, I'm in the headsets. I get the kid up and I'm like, are you okay? All right, everybody, let's hear it for Not Dead. Everybody honking their adventure bike horns, or I'm like, Not Dead, my favorite student. And I'm like, see, he proved it to us. You can have a get off without it being terrifying. Like, or, I can't get this. Everybody else is getting it, and I'm still stalling the bike. Rah, 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 rah. I say, don't worry. They're going to suck at something later in the day. I'll give you $1 if I'm wrong. Just try it again. And let me give you a little more time on this drill. I'm going to have everybody else go in and get a snack. You and me are going to stay for a couple more laps in the arena. And I try to give them privacy to have their own breakdowns and meltdowns. I definitely tell people to go for a walk. Let's just put the bike down, take your helmet off. Let's go for a little walk. Got a beautiful property. Go kick it with the donkeys for a second. Come on back. Let's talk. And it's obviously different if I'm speaking to a child versus an adult. Kids, I struggle actually more with kids, because I'm kind of like, what's your problem? Are you speaking English? Go talk to your mother. I don't know. Why are you crying? But because I only started age 12, that's usually not a problem. By that age, they're like real humans, pretty much. So I can kind of relate to them. With adults, though, I find that just the level of compassion and just saying like, dude, I've been there. You are not alone. And, putting your hand on their trapezius and just kind of squeezing hard to be like, stop thinking, feel this.
Well, I'm going to jump in. That's kind of an interesting point, because I find as a rider, and I've had people that know me really well say this, which is I will try to apply intellect to riding, and I will try to think my way out of things. And so I finally my technique is I try to think things so much, and then I try to let it go, and I try to become a more physical. But as we know, I know really great riders who can hardly tie their shoelaces. These are not smart, at least in the way that society determines intelligence. But they are just totally instinctive. And I mean, I played in a hockey team where the guy that was sort of the unofficial leader of the team was kind of this, half-employed occasional construction worker. And we had surgeons on the team, but he had this incredible physicality. So in some ways, it's we have to let go of the notion of intellect and get into this notion of physicality, don't you? Because you have to be able to understand what the bike is saying to you, because it's giving you all this information.
Yep.
That if
Absolutely.
you're tight or it negates the messages it's sending you, doesn't it?
Yeah. And I I talk about that a lot in my classes, where I say, this is the healthiest relationship I've ever been in, because I'm in a constant conversation with my motorcycle, and I'm not completely independent of the bike, but we're not codependent. If I'm riding properly, I'm standing up on the foot pegs, and we are interdependent, and it is a beautiful day. If either of us starts getting more dominant than the other, we get out of sync and the dance moves don't work. And I think people relate to that image a little bit. I also have to catch myself. I give everybody like a forearm stretch to do during class. And I tell them, hey, and this is a not so subtle way to tell me, wrap it up. You've been talking too long. We're ready to go try it. Because I do want the feedback from students, and you'll get, no doubt, 4 or 5 of them that are like, yeah, let me go. And the one guy who's like, but wait, is it after the apex or before the apex? Is it the left foot? He's still thinking through the moves. And so I have to push some along and hold some back to make it a group class. But we do a lot of activities to get people into the right body positions also. I found trying to explain, from a road rider to another road rider in my level 3 classes, trying to explain counterweighting makes people's minds melt. They've spent so much time, like you showed, on the inside foot peg with good traction. And I talk about an equation of, coefficient of friction and inertia and gravity, and I could explain it all day long. But I found what was really helpful came out of me just being frustrated. And I hook my leg around their tire. They're sitting in front of me. I'm standing behind their dirt bike, and I hook my hand under their rear fender, and I talk them through counterweighting. I make them tip the bike over. I hold the weight. And then I think it would make people really uncomfortable if I was male, but I put my hand on their hip and I push them over. I raise their elbow with my hand. I point to their foot, left foot here, right foot there. And eventually they get into this ridiculous counterweighted position. And I wave both my hands in front of them, and I'm like, you're holding the bike up right now. I'm no longer doing the holding. That's you balancing. And they're like, oh, that's what you mean. Because that needing to feel it, not intellectualize it, is so hard for people to get over. And I think we are all wired so differently, but many, many people that I find in the circles, certainly with like the hyper educated group of folks that I work with from DC, oftentimes are so cerebral, they're not coordinated.
Yeah.
And I gotta say, I have learned to ask, can you ride a bicycle? I've had to learn to ask that first before we even put helmets on, because I've now started sending people home if they can. I'm like, all right, if you can't balance a bicycle yet, I cannot help you in 6 hours. Go work on that. But if you got that much, I can do something with you. So that part's been pretty fun.
I was at a riding school earlier this summer, and it was on pavement, and there were pylons set up, and the idea was to weave between the pylons. And at whatever speed on pavement, straight, no issues with traction or visibility or anything like that. And I really kind of came to the conclusion, and these are all riders that everyone rode in on their own motorcycle. Everyone was of a certain age. I don't think there were even people, maybe a couple of people in their 20s, everyone older than that. But there were people who didn't understand the vaguest notion of how a two-wheeled vehicle works. They didn't understand the dynamics, the notion of countersteering. Because there was one gentleman riding along this thing, and he was on a Harley, and he was throwing his upper body from side to side. And his wife, who was supposedly the less experienced rider, was just neatly sort of, slowly but neatly applying it. And then at one point I was behind a woman on the track who'd ridden for a number of years and who works in media. And she has no idea of how a motorcycle works. And this notion of countersteering, I think, it's such a bizarre abstraction to people that they just can't get their heads around it. And I mean, I know a woman who came back from a school and was convinced that the only way to turn a motorcycle was by weighting pegs. And she's a very slow and I think very dangerous rider on the street. And how do you deal with that? Because it just seems like it's such a mind. I know what I want to say.
Yeah.
But I mean, how do you get past that? Because it just seems there's a lot of people riding who and whenever the notion of countersteering comes up in forums on ADV Rider, there's always a million comments where some people will deny that it even exists. How do you navigate through that?
I avoid specifically the topic of countersteering. I do not address it because I didn't realize until I went down to Motomark 1, another training school in North Carolina. I honestly had never analyzed what the bike was doing. And when they started talking about countersteering, my mind got scrambled. And it didn't click for me until I watched the Fortnite guy. I think that's his name, Ryan something.
Yeah, Ryan, yeah.
Where he did a little video with a block that wouldn't let you countersteer. And I was like, okay, I'm convinced. And I've tried to feel it and see it and do it. And I'm like, I think that was it. But it's so natural to people that already ride on two wheels of any kind that I find it superfluous to the conversation. I don't even want to argue about it. Let's talk about all the other forces at play and what you can do to influence the curve and increase your safety and increase your speed and things like that. That I find it's like trying to have a conversation of what's the best tire pressure. Everybody's going to have an opinion. And I don't think it's necessary to understand exactly what the physics are.
But it is bizarre though, because every kid that gets on a bicycle, by the end of the first day, whips them around like nothing. And yet they're actually doing something very sophisticated that is totally intuitive.
Exactly.
And yet some people really struggle, because it seems like up to at least what I've witnessed, and I like your opinion on this, it seems like up to a certain speed, you can go around at 15 miles an hour and a bike will sort of fall into a corner. But once you start moving quickly, especially if there's a chicane or a couple of trees you're dodging, I mean, you have to be physical with a motorcycle. And that's where they sort of run into trouble.
Yep. Yeah, no, I have actually dragged my mountain bike down from the house to my training arena to have a student prove to me he could actually balance a bicycle. And I couched it as nicely as I could, but I was really getting frustrated. And I had, it was holding up the whole class. I sent people off to have lunch and I asked him, hey, are you sure you know how to ride a bicycle? And he's like, well, I mean, it's been like 20 years. And I was like, well, I want you to prove it to yourself and just remind yourself how to balance. You've got to get the pedals moving first. You can't just pick your feet up, all that stuff. And I actually got out a bicycle for him to try it. And I think it kind of helped. It got through the idea of inertia helping with the balance and things like that. But I find specifically bringing in the wording countersteering is it's a futile exercise for most people's brains, that I'm like, you'll get there, you'll understand you're doing it, or you won't be successful in that corner. And at some point you're going to wonder why you crashed, or why you swung it too wide or something like that,
right.
And that's, I think part of it is I'm absolved of having to go to that level because I work with beginners. And And then the trainings I've had as a little bit more than novice dirt bike rider or adventure rider has all been about other techniques besides. That they didn't, those coaches haven't talked a whole lot about counter steering either. That it, like you said, it's a very complex process that our bodies somehow know how to do intuitively. The time I do notice it the most is when people try to turn from a just 2-lane road, try to make a turn in their car, and they think they have to swing all the way into the shoulder to go left when I'm about to pass them in the shoulder. That's when I notice it the most.
Assuming that a lot of people listening to this have a certain degree of off-road chops. I know that's a big ask, but let's just assume that for the purpose of my question, you've ridden off-road for 3 or 4 years, 5 years, you're a competent, careful, but competent rider. What are 1 or 2 things that you can, fairly briefly tell me that you see amongst slightly, maybe mid-level riders where there's a general area where people can improve? I know I'm asking for generalities, but is there something that you see?
I think across the board, one thing I noticed actually today working on a newsletter, I'm scrolling through lots and lots and lots of photos and footage from my classes, and the level 3 classes specifically, where it's folks that have been out riding on the street forever and they're doing dirt now, is, I think, myself included, we don't look far enough ahead. Our eyes are constantly getting outpaced by the bike. And I definitely find myself doing that. In the woods recently, just had to keep saying, eyes up, eyes up, eyes up. Come on, look ahead, look ahead. So I get so sucked into what's the traction like right here. And then of course my mind wanders into, no kidding, think about what you're doing in January. Why aren't you thinking about next season? How come you're stuck on Friday?
Right.
The whole metaphor of thinking further ahead by looking further ahead. But in the videos and pictures that I saw, we wear the peaked helmets, so it's very obvious where people are looking. And all the time, slow speed riding, everybody tends to look down. And I find that I have to keep reminding them, you're only looking as far ahead as the pace at which you walk right now. And even in first gear, moving that bike under power, you're creeping it along. That's still faster than you walk. So you've got to override a lot of nature to get yourself to look further in the distance. But I find that, having that currency, the distance being the currency with which we're buying the time, is something that all of us could do way better. The other one is, like we mentioned, the seeing a photo or video of yourself, to look at your own standing posture. I find the standing posture to be a very comfortable, lazy position for most of us, especially since on my farm you're doing it at slow speeds. But in the grand scheme of things, the super attack position and that really aggressive, legs straight over the pegs, head right over your windscreen, kind of L shape to the body, I rarely see any intermediate riders in that position. They're all still doing, I'd like to credit Dallas at Traction E-Rag, calls it the prairie dogging. You're standing straight up and you're prairie dogging. And
I know exactly what that is. Yeah.
Prairie dogging on their adventure bikes on those fairly high speed gravel turns or accelerating out of them, and they're still prairie dogging. And I don't know, I got to take a course with Rich Larson over the summer and had a friend take some video of me on a high speed acceleration drill where he had us actually lock out our knees and get our heads all the way over the bars. And we all thought we were doing it, and then saw pictures and it was terrible. And we tried again. And when I actually did the technique, I was like, oh my God, it's weightless. When I got my body out ahead of the momentum, it was incredible. And I think that I've analyzed this a lot in my own riding, and I see it with other people, it's very counterintuitive and counter to our survival to literally put your face first. And if your head is in the right position upon acceleration, like your face is the first thing out there in front of even your bars and your momentum. And it's a scary thing for your brain to not be like, whoa, that's an obstacle. Whoa, that's a corner. Like I want to unweight the front end with panic, but I need to weight the front end with that getting ahead of momentum concept that, really fixing your standing posture at speed and making those exaggerated, that's the big thing though, exaggerating those positions at slow speeds so that you build the muscle memory to go into those positions at high speeds when you
One,
don't have time to think about it.
one thing that I didn't realize I did until I read a comment by a reader on ADV Rider, and I was kind of shocked. And he said that every time he puts his turn signal on, he looks down at his hand. And I realize I've been doing that for 40 years of riding on the street.
That's
Is
wild.
I click the thing, and then now maybe it's because I ride old Ducatis and they're so crazily unreliable. But I will do that. I always look down and say, why am I doing that? And I didn't, talk about habits that you get into.
Yeah.
And I've written so much about riding, and I've been to schools, and I try to be conscious of what I'm doing. And yet, there it is.
Yeah, no, old habits die hard. I've been riding off-road mostly, and so never worry about turn signals. And I've also got these like jacked up thumbs where I've had some arthritis surgeries. So my thumb go-to position is not in my vernacular. And I had the opposite. I just inherited a BMW RT and was trying to get out and get some seat time on it. And it got dark on me, and I'm on a windy little road, and I'm like trying to find high beams, low beams, all this stuff. And I killed the motor because I didn't know where my thumbs were and I couldn't see them. I was like, oh no. Good thing I just, pulled the clutch in, coasted, pushed a few more buttons, and the thing started again. But yeah, no, we definitely are riders that do what we practice. And I find most of us don't practice anything. We just go out and ride and hope for the best. But if we're actually practicing a specific skill consciously, and at least for me, if I exaggerate it in a slow speed practice, it's going to get into the fiber of my being sooner than if I just kind of mark it and be like, oh yeah, I'm on that peg. Oh yeah, I'm kind of looking, but really doing the motions intentionally with consciousness in a practice setting before my body needs me to do it to keep me safe and alive.
How can I get more information about your school?
To get more information about us, the best resource is my website, just dcdirtcamp.com. We have a Facebook page and an Instagram channel, and emailing me is the best way. I try to make it look like a big old company, but it's pretty much a company of one. So I'm the marketing person and HR. If somebody's upset, I take that too. But info at dcdirtcamp.com is where I've kind of consolidated all the Facebook Messenger chats and the Instagram DMs and all that stuff. I kind of consolidate all of that right to email so that I don't lose track of people. And then I do send out a newsletter just sporadically. I don't sell anybody's information, but try to keep people posted on that stuff in terms of what's coming down the pike. We're closed for the winter until March, but we're planning on running a few wrenching clinics where people come out to the farm and actually learn how to do oil changes and air filter cleaning, things like that in the barn, and doing some travel with the bikes, possibly out to Arizona in February of 25. So getting people to fly and ride, giving them an opportunity to escape the snow and come hang out on some beautiful wide open OHV terrain. And then our regular season will resume in Middletown, Virginia, mid-March. And we generally run March through the end of June, finish up with the 4th of July, and then it gets really hot and humid here. So I take the bikes on the road again and go to other out rides to get people in the woods and to other events around the country. And then we run September through the beginning of December or end of November, depending on how holidays fall. But all of that stuff is in the newsletters, and I try to keep the website up to date. And we publish about a month or two of classes at a time so that people can plan ahead. Classes tend to fill about 2 weeks in advance. But because, like I said, we keep it pretty small to make sure everybody gets a lot of attention.
For more information about BJ Hessler's enterprise, visit dcdirtcamp.com. Thank you for listening to The Lowdown Show.